The dead man's essence did not rise like smoke. It came apart in strings. They peeled out of Kellen's cooling body in dim blue filaments, caught first in the blood spread across the stone, then in the jagged geometry of the room Thorne had forced into being. The new choke point drank the light greedily. Shelves of fresh-grown rock hummed. Every angle he had made for defense became a channel, and the channels led inward. Through them, the man's last untethered spark was pulled toward the crystal embedded in the rear wall. Toward him, Thorne tried for one weak instant not to take it. Hunger answered before conscience could. The filaments tightened, snapped free, and sank into his core with a cold sweetness that made the chamber shiver. Essence absorbed. 11. Mana reserves increased. Structural authority increased. Dungeon presence deepened. The notices rang through him like iron struck under water. The hill changed around that sound. He felt it in places he had not known were part of him. Hairline cracks far above the chamber, roots probing through damp soil, the slow drag of groundwater along buried stone. The cavern did not merely contain him anymore. It listened. Mana moved through the rock in narrow, bright currents, following the lines he had carved with intent, gathering in hollows and edges, collecting under the goblin's splayed fingers, under Mara's boots, in the throat of the entrance where he could kill the next thing that stepped through. The entire space had tightened around his will like a fist slowly learning it was a fist. Kellen's body remained. That was the part Thorne could not abstract. A moment ago the man had been a threat with a knife and a gilded slate and bad timing. Now he was a slack mouth, half-open eyes, one hand still crooked near the spilled pack, as if reaching for a tool he would never touch again. Thorne remembered the weight of old campfire laughter, of shared watch rotations, of trusting the man beside you to wake before the wolves came. He had known 100 Kellens once. Not this one, perhaps, but enough. Enough that the fact of the corpse landed with ugly precision. He had killed for survival. He had also gained from it. The second truth bit deeper. The chamber answered his unrest by becoming more efficient. Blood seeped into stone and did not vanish. It threaded into the room's fresh-made seams, darkening them, giving the new rock a marbled red cast like old meat under skin. The goblin watched with fever-bright eyes as the floor near the body roughened into sharper ridges, improving traction for smaller feet and making a human stumble likelier. Thorne had not consciously shaped that. The dungeon had learned from the kill and adjusted without asking whether it should. Environmental imprint accepted. Lair identity stabilizing. First blood recorded. Mara saw none of the words, but she saw the cave settle into itself. Her face went pale beneath the grime. "It's feeding," she whispered, not to him, not even to the goblin, but to the bare fact of the room. Her hand drifted toward the bread in the torn pack, then away, as if afraid any choice made here would count against her. Thorne wanted to tell her he was still himself, that there remained some line he would not cross. But the mana thrumming through Kellen's remains, through the choke point, through the hidden iron marker behind his crystal, made the claim feel thin as rotted cloth. Then the survey spike pulsed again. The sensation ran through the hill like a hammer blow down a buried nail. Far outside, rock cracked. A second strike followed, heavier, patient, deliberate. Dust sifted from the ceiling in a gray veil. The goblin flinched into its niche. Mara shut her eyes once and breathed out through her teeth, already hearing what Thorne heard now with dreadful clarity. Men at the passage mouth, widening stone, making room for shields, for spears, for the kind of company that came prepared when a scout failed to return. And deep in the chamber, wrapped around fresh strength and fresh guilt alike, Thorne drew mana into his new angles and began deciding where the next body would fall. He refused panic because panic spent mana and gave nothing back. Instead, Thorne turned inward and looked at the approach the way he would once have studied a ruin before breaching it. Angles, footing, lines of sight, places where confidence became exposure. The natural entrance was too broad for comfort even after his first narrowing. 2 men abreast could still force it if they came with shields, and the left wall bulged outward just enough to hide a second rank for half a heartbeat before they emerged. Half a heartbeat was a wound, a spear in a goblin throat, a boot on Mara's neck, iron on his crystal. He measured the corridor in gradients of threat and began shaving it down. Stone moved only where he paid for it. That was the first cruelty of being a dungeon. Intent alone was worthless. Every ridge cost mana, every shelf demanded structure, every elegant solution had to be bought with the same reservoir that kept his goblin breathing and Mara alive enough to be useful. He pinched the entry throat tighter, not enough to seal it and advertise intelligence, only enough to force a man to cant his shoulders. He lowered the ceiling by a span in the center, and raised knife-edged flanges along either wall, ugly natural-looking teeth that would catch shield rims and tear cloth from backs. Beneath them he flattened one strip of stone and left the next uneven. Small feet would learn the rhythm. Human feet would trust the smooth patch and break cadence on the rough. Choke point refined. Pathing bias established. Ambush efficiency increased. The labor of it hurt. Each alteration scraped through him as if his own bones were being filed to shape. Dust bled from seams. Thin cracks crept through the chamber before knitting shut under pressure. He understood then why so many cores turned brutish and obvious. Subtlety was expensive. Cleverness required patience, while enemies with lungs and legs closed distance. The system rewarded design, yes, but it did not care that design felt like carving your thoughts into your own flesh. Mara watched the walls narrow and said nothing for a long time. When she finally spoke, her voice had gone flat with practical fear. If they see worked stone, they'll know. They already know enough to dig, Thorne said. He drew his senses away from the kill lane and searched the rear cracks of the cavern, places a wounded stray or a fleeing creature might reach without crossing the entrance. A side fissure opened behind a curtain of hanging roots, shallow but dry, useless as defense, valuable for another purpose. He widened it by inches, rounded the floor, pinched the opening so a human had to crawl but something smaller could dart through. Refuge alcove created, den-linked sanctuary registered, hostility filter unresolved. He stared at those last words. The system did not understand mercy, only categories. Non-hostile was not safe. It was merely unconfirmed prey. Still, the little chamber settled into the dungeon's anatomy like a hidden organ, somewhere to pull the goblin back to. Somewhere even Mara might survive for a few more minutes if he decided survival outweighed feeding. The fact that he was budgeting compassion like ammunition made his old name feel farther away. Outside, the pounding stopped. Silence rolled down the passage, heavier than the blows had been. Thorne felt the goblin curl around its stolen breath in the new alcove's shadow. Mara eased one hand toward Kellen's dropped hammer, slow enough to ask permission without pretending otherwise. And from the entrance came the soft grind of loosened rock under cautious boots, followed by a man's voice, muffled by the throat of stone he had just made. "Lantern Company," the stranger called. "Answer if you're still breathing." Mara's fingers closed around the hammer, but she did not lift it. Thorne felt the decision in the room like a shift in pressure. If she armed herself openly, the next man through the choke point would assume alliance. If she stayed empty-handed, he might think her helpless, and helpless people hesitated. Hesitation could be shaped. Hesitation could be used. Thorne bled a thread of mana into the crystal veins scattered through the stone and coaxed a dim, corpse-blue glow along the narrowed passage. Not enough to reveal the chamber, just enough to turn the throat of the cave into a place that looked deeper, stranger, less certain than bare darkness. A second voice answered the first from outside, younger and raw with nerves. "Harl, leave it. If a nest woke in there, we're not paid enough." "You're not paid at all if we go back empty," the older man muttered. Boots scraped. Loose shale clicked down the slope. Thorne extended his senses as far as the choke point allowed and found them in fragments. 2 men, breath quick from digging, one carrying a pry bar, the other a woodcutter's axe polished by use rather than care. No guild steel, no disciplined formation, no priestly wards humming against corruption. Their fear tasted thin and immediate. Hunger sat beneath it, older and harder. Desperate men, then, not delvers by trade. Poor enough to come anyway. Mara heard it too. Not lantern, she whispered. Scavengers, or debtors, Thorne thought. Men pushed to the edge where rumor became employment. The moral line that should have steadied him only blurred further. If he killed them, he would feed. If he spared them, they would carry news. He adjusted the light again, drawing it farther inward, making the chamber seem to retreat. Then he shaped a shallow shelf in the floor just past the choke point and dusted it with pebbles balanced to slide. A stumble, not a slaughter, a test. The younger man entered first, hunched so low his shoulders brushed stone. He could not have seen more than a few paces ahead. Gods, he breathed, staring at the blue mineral glow. Harl, there's crystal. Then there's coin. Keep moving. He took one more step. Pebbles rolled. His foot skidded sideways and he slammed into the wall with a cry, dropping a bundled sack that burst open in a spill of stale onions, twine, and a single iron chisel. Not adventuring gear. House tools borrowed and repurposed. Behind him, the older man shoved forward in anger, not caution, and the narrowed stone forced his axe head sideways. It struck the extruded shelf above the passage with a hard clang that jarred through the cave. Cracks leapt where Thorne had weakened the lip. Warning flashed across his awareness. Structural stress rising. Choke point integrity compromised. Collapse chance, 38%. The older man saw Mara then and bared his teeth. There, girl, move aside. He lunged, and the ceiling answered before Thorne finished deciding. Stone sheared loose in a grinding sheet. The older scavenger threw up an arm and disappeared beneath rock to the waist, axe spinning free. The younger man screamed and scrambled backward, hands bloody where shale flayed them. Mara flattened herself against the wall, white-faced but untouched. Dust flooded the chamber. Beneath it all came a wet, crushed groan that ended abruptly, as essence bled out into the room and struck Thorne like heat. He could have sealed the passage. He could have dragged the younger one inward with shaping stone and taken the rest. Instead, he held the broken arch just open enough for escape. The survivor stared once at the buried man, once at the blue-lit crystal beyond, and terror made the choice for him. He fled into daylight, sobbing, leaving the sack, the chisel, and a smear of blood across Thorne's threshold. Mana rose from the dead, less than he wanted, more than he deserved, and the system pulsed with cold approval while somewhere beyond the entrance, a living witness ran carrying his fear into the world. By the time the next voices reached the mouth of the cave, Thorne had reshaped what he could without draining himself hollow. He drew a shallow shelf of stone just beyond the broken choke point and left it smooth, almost level, as if collapse had ended there by chance. He nudged loose shale into neat drifts, too deliberate to be natural unless fear blurred the eye. In the dark seams above, his goblin pressed flat with a stolen knife and a strip of Kellen's leather tied around its wounded arm. 2 cave rats waited lower down in a fissure he had widened with the last of his spare mana, their whiskers quivering at the stink of blood and onion. 3 people this time. Boots, not scavenger sandals. 1 step measured distances before taking weight. 1 struck harder than necessary, claiming space. The 3rd paused often enough to listen. Tomas wasn't drunk, a woman said from outside, her voice clipped and practical. He ran half the village awake and swore the cave swallowed Dren. A man answered with a laugh too easy to be honest. Then we pull out whatever coin is left in the dark and thank the cave for softening him first. The last voice came quieter. No, look at the cuts on the stone. They entered single file. First came the practical one. A broad woman in boiled leather, shield up, lantern hooded to a slit. Behind her moved a narrow man with a hooked smile and a butcher's cleaver riding where a sword should have been. The third, younger than the others, wore ink-stained gloves beneath travel grime and kept touching the walls as if reading them. When his fingers brushed the extruded shelf of Thorne's crafted passage, he stopped. "This wasn't here long," he murmured. "See the fracture line? It grew over a break." The cruel man snorted. "Rocks don't grow." "Dungeons do," Mara said from deeper inside, and all three of them jerked toward her voice. Thorne had not told her to speak. Still, he understood the value the moment she used it. The shield woman surged forward toward the living target, and her boot found the false level stone. It held just long enough to promise safety. Then Thorne released the support beneath one edge. Her ankle rolled. Shield slammed wall. Lantern flew from her hand, clanged, and went black. Darkness swallowed the room in one breath. The cave rats burst from the fissure at shin height. Not dangerous alone, but fast, squealing, all claws and panic. The cruel man cursed and hacked low at movement he could not see, his cleaver striking sparks from stone. Above him, the goblin dropped. Its knife flashed once across the back of his hand. He howled and lashed upward. Steel bit into hanging shale. Thorne had spent long minutes thinning to a rotten crust. This collapse he chose. Rock came down between them in a hard gray sheet. The shield woman and Mara vanished behind a curtain of dust deeper in the chamber. The cruel man staggered back toward the entrance, clutching his bleeding hand, while the curious one threw himself sideways and barely saved his leg from the fall. For an instant he lay there coughing, palm pressed to the stone, and Thorne felt the man's pulse racing through the floor. Then the young scholar looked straight toward the blue glow hidden deeper in the dark and whispered, with dawning horror instead of fear, "It's listening." The words thrilled through Thorne more dangerously than the essence of any death. Behind the new wall of rubble, Mara shouted something muffled and urgent. At the mouth of the cave, the cruel man backed into daylight and began yelling for ropes, for picks, for more men, while inside, trapped on the wrong side of the split, the curious one pushed himself to his knees and kept staring into the dark as if he meant to understand it before it killed him. The curious one did not beg. That, more than anything, made what followed feel chosen. He rose into the dark with one hand spread against the fallen stone, breath rasping through dust, and took a cautious step toward the faint blue pulse buried deeper in the chamber. Not blind panic, not flight, inquiry. Even now, with Mara shouting behind the collapse and the cruel man bellowing for help outside, this one wanted to see, wanted to know. Thorne felt that hunger in him and recognized it with a sickness that had once belonged to a man named Thorne, torch in hand, prying open old doors because mystery had always seemed worth the risk. Then the scholar's boot came down, where the floor still looked solid and wasn't. Thorne gave the weakened shelf beneath it a single precise pulse. Stone snapped. The man dropped to his thigh in a crevice no wider than a grave seam, and the jagged lip Thorne had left there for exactly this purpose sheared through leather, flesh, and artery. The scream was short, more astonishment than pain. He clawed upward, fingers scraping rock, but blood was already pumping hot across Thorne's floor, running into carved channels, feeding the den like a libation poured for something old and buried. The cave rats came first, frenzied by salt and warmth. The goblin came second, landing lightly beside the trapped man with both hands on its knife. Thorne could have stopped it. He knew that with perfect clarity. Instead, he held the stone steady while the goblin struck down into the scholar's throat. Once, twice. The struggle became wet and weak. Then it ended. Silence did not follow. The chamber filled with all the smaller sounds that death allowed to return. The drip of blood into a crack. The goblin's panting. Mara pounding her fists against rubble while shouting his name. Thorne absorbed the essence as it spilled free. It entered him in a cold rush of numbers and instinct power stripped clean of personhood before it settled into his crystal. Intruder slain by trap synergy. Essence absorbed. Dungeon core level increased. Available construction unlocked. Ossuary niche. Spawn path unlocked. Carrion mites. Threat rating adjusted upward. The messages rang through him with awful sweetness. He felt his walls more clearly than his conscience. The new room unfolded in his awareness before he had fully decided, a narrow honeycomb of burial pockets behind the main chamber where bones could be stacked, marrow drained, and ambient death made useful. Cheap, efficient, obscene. He built it anyway. Stone softened, folded, and calcified into neat recesses while the goblin dragged the scholar's body by the ankles, leaving a dark ribbon across the floor. Practicality had stopped asking permission. Outside, iron struck rock again. More voices now. Controlled, disciplined, not the ragged shouting of frightened scavengers. The cruel man had found reinforcements, or the guild had arrived faster than fear should have carried word. Mara heard them too. Her pounding ceased. When she spoke again, her voice was hoarse with dust and dread. "If they breach this," she said, "they burn everything." Thorne listened to the picks biting into his entrance, to the hidden survey spike still pulsing its betrayal behind his core, to the goblin feeding scraps to the rats in the dark like a priest tending lesser acolytes. Remaining small would not spare him. A weak dungeon was not left alone. It was mapped, exploited, and cut apart before it learned to defend itself. To survive meant layers, hunger, deniability, and worse choices made faster. So he reached into his growing structure, into every crack and shelf and buried seam that answered to his will, and began redesigning the approach while the next intruders were still coming. Stone flowed because panic left no room for hesitation. Thorne thickened the choke point until it became a bent throat instead of a doorway, a dogleg of jagged shelves and knee-high ridges that forced anyone entering to turn sideways under hanging teeth of shale. He spent mana on spiteful details. A slick patch where damp would gather, a false stable stone that would roll under weight, narrow rat runs only his goblin could use. The crystal at his center dimmed with every alteration. Hunger scraped through him at once, not metaphor now but a mechanical emptiness, a need measured in fractions and red warnings. Insufficient mana for full reinforcement. Structural improvisation quality high. Lethality projection increased. The pick blows outside changed rhythm. They had seen the cave mouth narrow and adjusted, patient men facing a problem to solve. Mara crouched in the dust behind her rubble prison, eyes wide and rimmed red, watching the corridor become a butcher's funnel. "You're making it worse," she whispered. "I'm making it expensive," Thorne said, and hated how calm he sounded. He put the goblin to work, not with words, with impulses. Drag bones here, spill blood there. Scatter the dead scholar's chalk where boots would slide. The creature obeyed in twitching bursts, wounded arm clutched against its ribs, yellow eyes bright with pain and devotion. In the new ossuary niche, femurs clicked into tidy stacks. Ribs nested into stone slots that had not existed a minute before. Waste became architecture. The sight of it revolted some shrinking remnant of Thorne that still remembered graves. The rest of him calculated marrow seep, ambient fear, vermin attraction, and accepted the trade. A spike of alien cold trembled through the wall behind his crystal. The survey marker pulsed once, then harder, and the bedrock answered. At first he thought it was another impact from outside. Then the vibration came from below, far beneath his chamber, a vast slow shudder moving through strata older than the hill. Hairline seams lit in his awareness where no light existed, geometric lines hidden in the rock like scars grown over. They did not belong to his design. They formed angles too precise for cavework and too enormous for a single room. Shafts collapsed long ago, hexagonal foundations, sealed arteries descending into black pressure. He touched one by accident with a thread of mana, and something impossibly deep touched back. Unknown substrate detected. Legacy construction present. Authority conflict dormant. Do not awaken. The warning cut off in static. For one suspended instant, Thorne felt another pattern beneath the hill, not a mind exactly, but the fossil of one. Habits calcified into stone, defensive logic sleeping in layers, old hunger banked under centuries of silence. It noticed his intrusion the way a buried leviathan might notice a flea biting through scar tissue. Doors he had never built shifted somewhere in the depths. Dust breathed upward through cracks. Very far below, a mechanism groaned. Outside, the breach team finally broke through the first narrowed arch. Fresh air rushed in, carrying torch smoke, sweat, and the iron confidence of armed men. One voice barked orders. Another cursed at the slick floor just before stone clattered and someone screamed. At the same moment, a seam split open along the rear of Thorne's chamber with a sound like a jaw unlocking. Black air exhaled from the gap, old as tombs and colder than groundwater. Beyond it lay worked steps descending into the earth, each edge cut with worn sigils that made his crystal ache. The hidden structure under the hill was not dead. It was listening now, and the next intruders were no longer the worst thing approaching him. The cold struck first. A clean blade of it laid against every surface of the chamber. Frost traced the lip of the new-made seam. The bones in the niche clicked softly as if teeth had begun to chatter. Thorne recoiled on instinct and then, because instinct no longer ruled him alone, split his attention in 3 directions at once. The breach, Mara, the opening below. Men shouted in the corridor. One had fallen. Another hauled him clear with curses edged in pain. A torchlight bloom wavered against the constricted stone, painting the butcher's funnel in stuttering gold. Thorne felt the false footing shift under a heavy boot, heard the crack of shin on rock, the wet skid where blood met chalk. Expensive, he had said. He had bought himself seconds. Mara had gone very still. Her eyes were fixed not on the soldiers but on the stair beyond his chamber, on the darkness breathing up from it. That was here, she said, voice thready with disbelief. All this time? No, Thorne said, though he was no longer certain whether he meant no, it was hidden, or no, it was not meant for you. The goblin gave a small animal whine. Every patchwork impulse of obedience in it trembled. It could feel the thing below as surely as he could, and unlike him, it had no pride to mistake terror for curiosity. It backed away from the seam until its shoulders struck bone stacks, then sank into a crouch with its good hand over its head. A pulse moved up the buried geometry under the hill. Not sound, not light, an issuance. The sigils carved into the steps kindled the color of old bruises. For a moment Thorne understood them without reading. Boundary, custody, continuity, debt. The meanings pressed directly into the lattice of his being, and his crystal answered before he could stop it, a thin, involuntary flare. The deep mechanism recognized the signal and revised him in an instant from irritation to category. Unauthorized occupancy confirmed, local core active, lineage absent, claimant status false. The words were not heard. They arrived already known, branded across his awareness hard enough to make his chamber swim. Cracks raced along the ceiling. Somewhere below, locks the size of houses began to withdraw. Outside, the men reached the kill zone in earnest, shields up. Hook the rubble, saints, what is that smell? Thorne triggered the slick patch. A boot shot sideways, metal rang off stone. Someone crashed into the bone niche and sent a white avalanche across the corridor. His goblin, panicked into brilliance or madness, darted through a rat run with a shard of femur and slashed the calf of the nearest man before vanishing under falling rubble. The answering scream was short. The backswing of a sword took the goblin in the shoulder and hurled it spinning. Thorne felt the impact like a hook through his own nerves. Mana reserves critical. The chamber dipped. Hunger hollowed him until every warm body nearby shone like food. Mara saw it in him. Whatever she had meant to beg died behind her teeth. She crawled backward from the rubble wall, away from his crystal, away from the stair, as if she could choose which nightmare reached her first. Then something came up the steps. Not fast, not dramatic. A single shape detached from the dark below with the patience of an answer long delayed. It was man-sized only by mercy of perspective, wrapped in mineral accretions and strips of metal green with age, as though a statue had learned to move without ever becoming alive. Its face was a smooth mask scored with the same worn sigils, and where eyes should have been, 2 sockets burned with a dim furnace red. It climbed the last step and stopped in the split seam, looking first at Thorne's crystal, then at the breach where torchlight and shouting men crowded closer, then at Mara. When it spoke, the voice came from the walls themselves. "Custodian destroyed," it said. "Emergency protocol transfers to nearest functioning core." Its head turned back to Thorne. "Open," it commanded, "or be opened."